Okay, thanks, David. So, as David said, I'm going to talk to you about establishing competency of staff in flow cytometry. And I'm going to talk about achieving ISO standard 516, which is the particular ISO standard that deals with competency assessment. Just to give you an overview of where I work and the type of things that we do, the Immunology department is based in the Clinical Sciences Centre at Manchester Royal Infirmary, and it's one of the biggest hospital sites in Europe. We have 19 staff, a mixture of MLAs, APs, assistant practitioners, and biomedical scientists. And we are a regional department, and around 70% of our work is for outside hospitals, we're outside services, and we carry out roughly around 17,000 flow analyses a year looking at immunodeficiency and hematological malignancy, and there's a list of the tests that we concentrate on there. The flow work that we do is only actually a small fraction of the work, but in terms of complexities with staff input and time, it is by far the most challenging. So the instruments we have two FP1000s. These are processors, if you're not familiar with Beckman-Coulter, and these are primarily used for CD4 counts, processing CD4 counts. And we have two rather elderly FC500s, and we're just about to renew our equipment and hopefully upgrade to something more modern. And the equipment's interfaced with our hospital LIMS via data innovations, so a lot of our results are transferred electronically to our hospital LIMS system via data innovations. The lab achieved, we went our first ISO visit back in November 2013, and we achieved ISO September 2014, and we've just recently undergone our first surveillance visit, and our acute leukemia panel was one of the tests that was focused upon. It's important to make the distinction between what is training and what is competency assessment. And I would refer people to the Institute of Biomedical Sciences guidelines, benchmark policy on management of laboratory training. And that outlines the roles and responsibilities and governance arrangements for training in the lab. And it also makes a distinction between what is, you should have a training policy as well as a training program. And that was published in January 2014. And training obviously will help underpin competence in terms of evidence. So it's important, not only do you get your competency assessment right, you get your training right as well. Flow analysis is a special case. Well, yes, there's a onus on hospital trust to ensure that patient safety is of the paramount importance. And in part we can do this by ensuring our staff are adequately trained and fully competency assessed. There's CNST and the NHS Litigation Authority and Care Quality Commission will all look at whether we can competency assess our staff properly if our trusts ever come under an inspection. It's very often said that flow cytometry is an art rather than a science. And whilst this is debatable, there's no doubt that flow cytometry requires a high degree of skill and understanding of how the instrument works, how the experiments are set up, so on, more so than probably any other equipment that we would use in the lab. And it's important that our staff know what they can and can't do with a flow cytometer, know the limitations of the instrument, and know what to do if something goes wrong, and know what the consequences are of changing the parameters of the instrument. So yes, flow analysis, we consider it to be a special case. So what do we want to avoid? So we want to avoid this scenario, and I think we're all probably guilty of heading for that computer terminal and firing up Google, and other search engines are available if you so require. So our competency assessment scheme that we use, the process that we use in the Immunology department at Manchester Royal Infirmary, has held us in good stead over a number of years, seen us both through CPA and now more recently ISO. And as CPA accredited laboratories, we're probably familiar with standard B9.3, the CPA standard that deals with competency. And the one thing that you can say about this standard is it's notable by its brevity. It's in fact actually very brief and open to a certain degree of interpretation. With ISO, we have a benefit of slightly more detail on the standard. So this is standard 516 in its entirety, and it states, following appropriate training, the laboratory shall assess the competence of each person to perform assigned managerial or technical tasks according to established criteria. And we heard this morning David Hughes talking about the EQA aspects of what is a managerial and technical tasks. This has caused some problem for ISO, and certainly was highlighted for some of the pilot sites that, okay, as biomedical scientists we can demonstrate our competency, but how do the medical staff do that, and so on. So it's spread the scope, in fact, to other grades of staff. It states reassessment shall take place at regular intervals and retraining shall occur when necessary. Helpfully, ISO 15189 516 includes two notes. And the first note actually provides detail of what is expected in terms of competency assessment. So it actually maps out the approaches that we should take. It tells us we should use direct observation, monitoring and recording of examination results, review of work records, and assessment of problem-solving skills. So this note is actually quite useful, and we should focus on this when we're carrying out our assessment of competence. And there is a second note, and the second note states that competency assessment for professional judgment should be designed as specific and fit for purpose. Now, the note doesn't actually define what professional judgment is. You have to look to standard 512, which covers personnel qualifications to find what the definition is. And it defines professional judgments as being opinions, interpretations, predictions, simulations, and models and values, and should be in accordance with national, regional, and local regulations and professional guidelines. So there immediately we can focus on the fact that it's referring us to national, regional, and local regulations and professional guidelines. So, as was discussed this morning, the BCSH standards, guidelines for flow cytometry, multicolour flow cytometry, come into play, and we should adhere to those. So, putting the system in place, what do we actually do at Manchester Royal Infirmary? So, all our competencies are procedural based, and we assess both the ability to practice, so the individual skills of the individual, the technical skills, and we assess their knowledge. And that obviously is dependent on staff grade, so the assessment an MLA would undergo would be different to a biomedical scientist, for example. And the assessments are carried out usually by senior members of staff who have had a reasonable amount of in-depth training and experience to oversee the assessment. We have 4 levels of competence. So from 1 where the individual may have limited or no experience, up to level 4, which covers whether they can whether they're competent and can they assess others. You don't have to use this particular approach. You can use a simple pass-fail approach, or you can assign users, intermediate users, super users, so on. So I think as long as you can establish a criteria and justify that criteria for competency assessment, you will be okay when it comes to your ISO inspection. So, designing and undertaking assessment, consider the procedure and the complexity of it. What does it involve? The staff grade that carries out that procedure, what do they do, or what you expect them to do, and what methods of assessment you're going to use. And there are a number of attributes that you want to cover, so you want to know if the individual demonstrates the knowledge, depth and breadth of experience, what their problem-solving skills are, do they have the technical dexterity, the analytical skills to carry out the flow assays, and interpretive skills as well as being safe to practice. Because we're an immunology department and we carry out a wide range of other tests, not just flow analysis, we have template documents, and we have 3 main documents that we use upon which to guide and record our competence assessments. We have a primary assessment document that covers the procedure or the interpretation of results, then a document for reassessments, and we also have a document to verify an assessor's competence. And the completed documents are held within the department as a permanent record. They are accessible for staff, so if staff want to take a copy for the CPD folder, they're entitled to do that. But we keep them locked away in a filing cabinet. Primary assessments, so this is what we cover in our primary competence assessment. What I've done, I've some of the slides give you screenshots of the assessment documents that we use. If you want a copy, I assume you'll have a copy of this presentation after, or you can email me. I can email you the presentation so you can have a look and see how the documents are formatted. So, primary assessment document, we log down the assessment method, the level of competency of the individual, and we include comments about the evidence that we've identified and assessed, and plus the competency signed off by the assessor and dated. Assessing the assessors. So this has been obviously a topic that CPA have focused on before. How do we assess the assessor? And we verify our assessor's ability to competence assess every 2 years. And the individual must demonstrate that they've kept up to date with new developments and maintain their knowledge base. And they may do that in a number of ways. It's actually quite difficult to do, and certainly difficult to do on a reoccurring basis. So every 2 years, the assessor goes through this process of completing the pro forma that you'll see on the next screen. But you need to be imaginative and innovative and identify new ways of assessing your assessors, simply because you tend to send an assessor on one advanced user training course if you're not going to send them on the same course every 2 years. So this is what our verification of assessor document looks like. Again, supporting evidence, what that is. We include both mandatory and optional evidence, and it's signed off by either the laboratory manager or the training lead in the department. Flow cytometry, just put this up as an example. It's always useful to use a checklist, so you can map the different stages of the process to the individual, and you can make sure that you cover all aspects of the procedure. And this one is an example of one that is actually provided in the BCSH guidelines on multicolor flow cytometry. Then, if we just quickly look at some evidence, so can the individual select the correct panels? Can they input data correctly? These are all things that we would want to cover. Do they know what to deal with if you have a breakdown or a blockage or other faults with the instrument? Do they know how to design an experiment, set up a protocol, run a panel and review the data from that panel? It's always a good idea to, at the same time you carry out a competence assessment, you can do an examination audit at the same time. So essentially kill two birds with one stone. So not only do you competency assess the individual, you actually get out an examination audit out of the process. Can the individual review flow plots? Are they able to troubleshoot the instrument, identify problems that have gone wrong in terms of gating, compensation? Can they correctly identify cells and so on? And then the post-examination procedures, this is where we focus on professional judgment. Are they able to carry out correct interpretations, so on. We reassess every 2 years. We have a basic reassessment form. If, for any reason, staff may have had an absence from work for a long term, or where there's been a long time, a break in service, we may want to undergo a full reassessment, but this is an example of our basic reassessment form. And our competency records are all summarised into an Excel spreadsheet where we can put alerts into the spreadsheet so they will flag when a competence is due to fall out of date and is due for renewal. And the whole competency assessment process is embedded into our quality management system. So the process, the momentum of the process is continued, and we review competency during our quality meetings. Staff receive individual progress reports as to how they're doing with their competency assessments, and we embed competency assessment into individuals' appraisals. Just a few other issues. Break in service, how long does that have to be before we undertake a full competence assessment? What do we do with locum staff? We have to competency assess locums. Out of hours working, how do we cover out of hours working, for example? When does a perceived issue with competence become a persistent management issue, performance management issue? And how do we moderate assessors to ensure consistency between assessors if they're assessing more than one competency? We're well blessed in the flow community in that there are a large number of different resources for us. Already mentioned the National Academy for Clinical Flow Cytometry. We have NEQUAS LI, the second part, the interpretive scheme that we can all individually register for that. We at MRI have used the VeriQuas scheme to assess our performance, assess the performance of the individuals in the department. And there's various training courses that are available, are listed there. In terms of publications, there's not many publications, in fact, although I would recommend David Barnett's guide book if you want to read about ISO 15189 more generally. There's a small appendix at the back of the BCSH guidelines on multicolor flow cytometry that covers competence assessment. And then there's just, dare I say, I've Googled competence assessment flow. There's just one paper that seems to recurringly come up as covering flow cytometry. So whatever process we follow, it must be simple, manageable, realistic, and effective. At that point, I'll end, and any questions?
Well, thanks, Andy. First of all, just a point of order. It's Barnett, not Barnett. There's one letter difference. That's a big issue as far as I'm concerned. I think that was a very, very good overview, and I'm sure that there are many of you out there that are going down this route to finding some routes to try and assess competence. And it seems to me that a lot of the work's been done here by Andy in particular. And I think Andy has offered to share the information that, particularly on this talk. And it seems to me that it would be rather pointless to try and reinvent the wheel. We've got a starting point here, and people can build on this. And I think if anybody does want to see what Andy's done, I think see him afterwards. I think it's very good. Are there any questions? Sure.
I want to ask two questions. First of all, on average, how long does it take for a staff member to be declared fully competent in flow cytometry lab?
How long? How long is a piece of string? I think if you go through the, obviously this is competence assessment, it's different training. That is very much down to the judgment of the senior who oversees the flow cytometry section, who's supervising that person. So I don't think there's any set period of time that you would state that somebody has to undergo training. It's an open-ended thing. But I think when you take somebody through a competence assessment, you have to be happy that they're going to succeed. It's the same approach that we take to taking people through the registration portfolios. Yeah.
Secondly, I want your expert opinion on two issues quickly. First of all, do you think that staff in flow cytometry should be permanently placed in flow cytometry section, treating it as a specialist section? And secondly, do you think that flow cytometry should be part of hematology rather than immunology?
I'm only here to talk about competency. The other issues there. Certainly, the staff in our department rotate, and they rotate around the other sections in the lab and carry out a wide variety of different techniques. Bar probably one or two staff, the majority of the staff are able to pick up flow cytometry and carry out the techniques in a competent manner. Whether flow cytometry should fall under the Department of Hematology, I'm not qualified to say that.
I think.
Are you satisfied that it's part of immunology? Are you personally satisfied that it is fulfilling all the purpose of hematology as well as immunology, being a part of flow cytometry? Because more than 90% of work in flow cytometry is related to hemato-oncology.
Well, I beg to disagree. Yeah. If you work in a hospital where you have a large paediatric immunology service, we get a lot of paediatric flow work that isn't hematology related, it's not malignancy related. And if you go to the immunology departments up at Newcastle, the RVI at Newcastle, they don't do much hematological malignancy work. It's all immunodeficiency based.
I think, can I add to that? I think the thing here is that you've raised an interesting point, and this is where The NICE IOD guidelines are really designed to come to the fore, I suspect, in the fact that we're looking at multidisciplinary team meetings. So irrespective of whether you're doing leukemia diagnostics by flow in an immunology lab, you would expect that somebody somewhere on the line has looked at the bone marrow and done the morphology aspect, done the cytogenetics, and you all sit down together. And I think the issue that you are probably driving at will come if an immunology laboratory is in isolation and doesn't necessarily issue the results without consultation and take into account all the other aspects of that leukemia in question, whether that be the morphology, the cytogenetics, etc. And I think that may be where the problem comes. But from a multidisciplinary team side of things, that's the way the UK should be going in terms of driving that forward. So we all sitting down with other disciplines, whether you're immunology and haematology. And I would concur with Andy that, you know, gone are the days when flow cytometry was in haematology or was in immunology, and let's not forget that most of flow cytometry originally started in immunology based on CD4 counting and a few leukemias. So, you know, there's a solid base there. I've got a question to Andy. How long does it take, do you think, to get somebody to be a competent and then to maintain that? So it's coming at it from a probably slightly different angle to what you were asking. Is the time invested worth the effort?
Certainly, I think from our point of view, the more staff that you have who are able to carry out the flow work, the better. Your department's better for it. You can cover things like staff absences and so on. It does take a lot of time though, and it is probably one of the more demanding techniques that we train people on in the department. Yeah, I would say so.
Are there any other questions?
Hi, just a really quick question. You touched on assessing the assessors, and I just wondered what the protocol in your laboratory was for assessing your lead flow cytometrist.
Sorry, just assessing the assessors. What was the final thing you said?
I was just wondering what the protocol in your laboratory was for assessing sort of your head of department, your lead flow cytometrist, as it were. Do you involve medical staff?
No, and this is one of the things that ISO have picked up on. It's certainly one of the things that was referred to earlier on. So the definition that I showed before refers to both managerial and technical competence. That really, the ISO guidelines don't really cover that and how that should be done. And when ISO carried out the pilot sites, it was a real issue for UCAS in tackling how laboratory managers and head of departments should be competency assessed. So at the moment, we don't actually, we at MRI don't actually competency assess our clinicians, for example, or our laboratory manager for flow or any other aspect of the service that we provide.